I'm so pleased to have on the line today very special guest, Dr. Marv Trager, who is a retired psychotherapist, PhD, doctorate in psychology. He is also a former Marxist radical who was so far to the left, as we've been talking with him about, that at one point, the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, he and a group of comrades bolted from the Communist Party because it wasn't communist enough. It was communist in name only, not far enough to the left. Well, in this century in particular, he had his roto-rooter process that eroded that leftism and became a conservative, and now is even a strong supporter of President Donald Trump. Marv, it is so great once again to have you here. Thanks for sticking around today and being a part of the program. We really got in the first segment into some depth about understanding some of the identity politics roots on the left, and also your own ideological development over time, from being someone who helped Bernardine Dohrn tweak a speech in the 1960s and who was involved in very many different radical movements and so forth back then, on to becoming a conservative now. Today, you might have seen in the news a thing or two about a little bit of civil unrest that's going on in the country today. And there was so much of what you said at a few different points in the first segment that just really resonated with the dynamics today. And I do want to talk about some of these different elements, but I've spoken long enough, so please sort of set the stage here on what your sense is for what we're seeing.
Well, the first thing that I think is worth noting, that I've noted, is that the demonstrations that are going on right now, the protests, the rioting, the looting, have a certain different quality than they did in the 60s, particularly during the civil rights movement. What did a peaceful protest look like in the civil rights movement? Well, you might have 30 people across the front line, maybe Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and all of the different leaders, and then people behind them and holding signs and protesting, and and then they would have monitors so that the demonstrators monitored their own forces. For the most part, you didn't need the police to monitor it. In fact, the police in the South would attack the march and were the opponents of the march. So when violence erupted, it erupted because of a police attack on a peaceful march. Now, the protesters like to talk about the right of assembly and the right of peaceful protest, and absolutely, that's a proper thing to do. However, what we have in these marches is you have something that, maybe begins and starts like a peaceful protest, but it starts to involve provoking and confronting the police and haranguing the police. And then people start lobbing things from the back and egging on the police to do something, and bricks are thrown and stones are thrown. And then the so-called peaceful protesters, they don't try to stop the people who are doing that in the back. They're, that's all, part of them as far as they're concerned. And then as day turns into night, the level of violence steps up, and the afternoon's peaceful protester becomes an evening's violent protester. Now, added to that, you have organized groups like Antifa that generally the left tends to work through mass movements where they lead the mass movements, but they hide their own full program. And but in these, and that's a generalization, but in these demonstrations, you actually have groups with their own specific program, like Antifa, who hide themselves because they're engaged in so much violence, and Black Lives Matter movement, and that movement is led by Marxists. The founder, you can go on the internet and find it, supports Marxism, and was answering a question from an interviewer that said, tell me, what's going to happen to the Black Lives movement? Is it going to disintegrate? Is it going to dissolve once the demonstration? No. We're ideological. We're Marxists. We're trained Marxists, and we're organized. And then another leader of the movement said that with regard to these stained glass windows and statues in Europe, that Jesus's images should be smashed. And this was because Jesus was portrayed as a Caucasian in many of these images. And of course, Jesus was portrayed in all sorts of countries, more or less looking like the people of that country, just for the sake of easier identification. But that was enough to want this organization and this guy to destroy
and
those
Marv,
kinds of.
we do have the tweet actually, and for those watching,
Oh,
we're going to
really?
have Nathan Matoush put the tweet up on the screen. This is Sean King, one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're right. He was specifically talking about how white supremacy was exemplified in stained glass windows of, quote, white Jesus, and therefore they needed to be taken down. And one of the things that I was expressing the other day is a concern about how they might go for, they've already been tearing down statues. I wouldn't be surprised if some of these people start actually destroying stained glass windows in churches across the country. Now, I hope that's not the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was.
Don't be surprised.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, when they're destroying statues, so that's what they're doing. Those are objects, right? Symbolic and with great attention, without anybody voting on it or any democratic decision to remove it or anything like that, any discussion. So it's completely undemocratic and it's complete mob rule. But in addition to that, they're engaged in cancel culture through the internet and through pressure on organizations and businesses. Anyone who steps out of line loses their job and is out. So if you're destroying statues and you're canceling the culture of people, pretty soon it will reach the point, it seems to me, when they will start taking out people. I mean, it has to go to that next step
at
Marv, some point along the line.
We have seen some extremists already who have beaten elderly women, for example. Now, I do want to say that I think I talk with a lot of people who believe in Black Lives Matter, are supporters of the cause, but what most people, I think, believe, and even most of the people who show up to these during the day protests, most of them believe, hey, there is racial injustice, there's excessive policing that particularly targets people of color, especially black people, and we need reform. And they genuinely believe that there needs to be change. But then you have this fringe group that has all of this this sense of strength that they can go out there and bring down all the statues or loot property or burn down courthouses and what have you, particularly because they can get away with it. My contention is that those people are less serious about some kind of genuine, at least racial improvement cause, and have either a much more radical agenda, or they're just trying to push the limits to see how far they can go with destroying private property and even public property and eradicating property protection and this notion of property rights, how far they can go before the police will intervene. So I think most of the people who say they support Black Lives Matter genuinely believe that as something sincere but not radical. And then you have these radical elements. However, where there's a rub is the radical and extremists that are destroying property are not only getting away with it because the police aren't acting to stop it, but they're getting away with it because others who say they support Black Lives Matter are, for one reason or another, unwilling to condemn that kind of activity. And I think for most, it's out of fear. But in some cases, you may see some of the more extreme elements who may find themselves thinking, you know what, this is okay with me. Let them do it if they want to.
Well, I don't think that it's very clear what the Black Lives Matter movement and in general what the reforms that are being sought are.
Right.
As a matter of fact, in most of the cities, remember, all of these cities, just about all of them, are run by the Democratic Party. Atlanta, for example, the police force is 58% African American. The mayor is black. The
police
whole
chief was, I think.
structure of the police chief was also black. And there have been reforms, and you're not finding in those places, and the statistics do not show, like in the number of dead blacks killed by whites versus the number of whites killed by black, police officers and all of that kind of stuff. Pretty much this is not fundamentally a problem anymore. Here's what is a problem, and it's more subtle, and that is that there is still a tendency, which is pretty much true in large parts of the country, for if you're an African American, you're liable to be looked over more by policemen, right. Whether the policeman's black or white. It's a subtle form of profiling, and that's because there is so much crime that comes out of the black community, and the gangs and all of that kind of stuff. So therefore, I think that that subtler form, which many African Americans do suffer, still to this day, but it's harder to address, and it certainly isn't being addressed by any clear demand. So, for example, the demand to reform the police union. Well, there is in some police unions the continuation of the code of blue, where they protect one another, and the union is behind that, and sometimes that leans in the direction of a racial component, but it also can lean in another direction as well. But the police unions also help get the wages of policemen up, so it's also a mixed bag. So all of these things are really a mixed bag. But the key thing I think we need to understand is that none of this would be happening if it were not for the Democratic Party. Everything that happens this year, I don't care what it is about the elections. If somebody blows their nose, it's about the elections. So all of these things are being enfolded into the election process, and the Democrats, who were so desperate at Trump sailing to victory in the prosperity, is now trying to politicize both the COVID-19 pandemic and these riots, and trying to blame them on Trump and blame them on Republicans, even though this is the consequence of 50 years of Democratic rule in the cities where the riots are taking place.
Well, let me jump in and just add that.
Go ahead.
Just real quickly, I would want to say that in those inner cities, the socioeconomic conditions are the driving factors, and you do tend to find minorities and blacks, especially African Americans, in inner cities where the socioeconomic conditions are much more challenging for people, which is why I think you see a lot of the crime that happens in those areas being more pronounced. And yes, those cities are run by Democrats. Go ahead.
Well, and some of the arguments are that the police are too brutal, with people, and it falls on blacks. And some of the police are, but for the most part, they're now wearing body cams. They're called up on it. There's all kinds of obstacles. But in Chicago, the problem is that the police won't do anything about the horrendous mass slaughter going on between the gangs on the south side and the west side of Chicago, and there's no attention paid to that. And the police do not intervene. And the police chiefs in every one of these cities is in the pocket of the mayor. And it's a Democratic mayor and a Democratic police chief. And frankly, the mainstream media is the principal force that these guys have to try to pin this on Trump.
Right. Dr. Marv Trager, again, our guest, former Marxist radical back in the 1960s, turned conservative. One thing that you said in the first segment when we were talking about the nature of the left back in the 60s, the Marxist movements, the radical movements, was that that the black Marxist leaders ended up sort of taking greater positions of authority compared to the white Marxist leaders who basically, it seemed, ceded that sort of a leadership position in that way. Can you expand on that and kind of tie in what we're seeing right now with Black Lives Matter in particular and the radical elements of that and how it's panning out on the far left?
Well, you have white young people in their 20s and 30s, often college graduates, who are, you could say that a large majority of the protesters, and they have bought a bill of goods at the universities and the colleges, where a generation of 60s graduates became Marxist professors. I mean, think about it. I mean, even Bernardine Dorn and Bill Ayers, who were engaged in bombings and things like that, end up on the faculties and guests and honored guests of different universities. And it doesn't stop there. It goes on and on. Well, so they're the product of all that. So one of the things that's different today, which I was going to mention earlier, is that I would say, whereas the people protesting in the 60s were still very pro-American, even in the anti-war movement, the marchers today are really shaky about their understanding, confidence, and support for the American experiment and vision. They're ignorant of it, for one thing, but they also, because of things like the 1619 Project that the New York Times has pushed and publicized, they have a substitute ideology that this was a racist country born in 1619, not 1776, and that it's an original sin, and it can never be eradicated. You can change this and change that, but you'll never, ever completely get rid of white privilege. So the whole structure has to be torn down. And a lot of the mass of the protesters, in one way or another, to some degree, support that vision. And that's what makes this particularly dangerous.
So, Dr. Marv Trager, back in the 1960s, I mean, the Black Panther movement was the leading part of the Marxist movement. And as I recall, I mean, you had dated a black woman, if I recall correctly. The Black Panther said, no, you can't continue with the relationship. But talk to us a little bit about that dynamic back in the 60s in terms of the Marxist movement and the racial angles there onto today and what we're seeing with the movements right now.
Well, as I mentioned, SDS thought of itself as
Students for a Democratic Society.
So the question, right, Students for a Democratic Society, which was this mass student organization, which became increasingly radical and Marxist, they thought of themselves as an auxiliary to the true modern proletarian revolutionary, who was the African American, the black militant. Because they were the most oppressed. So who was going to lead the revolution? Not the working class, but the most oppressed. So who were the most oppressed? Well, those who were racially under thumb. So therefore, a kind of weird identity politics whereby whatever ideology the most oppressed expressed, then that was what we all had to get on board with. And if we challenged it, we could be challenged in terms of our credentials for being white or middle class, or and all of that is morphed until you're pretty much, if you're an older white male, heterosexually gendered,
right.
oriented
I follow.
person.
Yes.
Yeah. Then you got nothing to say, buddy. Well, step
So in other words,
aside.
it's not just about working
history.
class. It's not just about working class. The proletariat. You've got people who actually are they're basing things along other lines for most oppressed and categorizing people versus has it long been that way? It's not just the working class, it's underneath the working class you then have a hierarchy.
Yeah, they tweaked Marxism that way. Marxism had its own underclass. It was called the lumpen proletariat, who were people who were declassed and were broken and were, according to Marx, used as police spies. But what we need is a pushback, Jimmy, because all of this is taking place, and the Republicans are, other than a few, are really just unwilling to, say anything. And they're just kind of watching and waiting. And I think that this is, it'll all peter out. It'll all kind of exhaust itself. Things will go back to normal. No, it's not like that. They're just going onward and onward, and it's going to continue. So I think there has to be a pushback. And I think that the Trump campaign has got to retool. I think that unless they retool, they're going to end up in trouble. And so, for example, make America great again. I don't think that's an appropriate slogan for this coming election. Here's why. Because make America great again, it was new, it was fresh. It caught the imagination of people. It was last election's slogan. If you try to use it again, to what?
Keep America great, CAG. Keep America great.
Yeah, but that's down the toilet. Because COVID came.
Oh, yes.
And the riots came.
Right.
So
right. I was just clarifying. MAGA's out. I mean, people still say it, but MAGA's not their slogan. It was "Keep America Great." But so, what do you think should be the slogan?
Well, that's hard to figure out because I think it should be related to the concept of preserving the American way of life. I think what's really under threat right now is our way of life. A certain sense of normalcy, of legality, of law and order, of opportunity, of all these things. So a friend of mine came up with a couple of words, and I think that they would work because they'll fit in a hat, they'll fit in a T-shirt. America matters. Very simple. America matters. Trump gets up, he gives a rally, and he says, America matters. And then he develops 15 reasons why it matters. And then the people have the hats. And I love that particular phrase because, you see, it allows the person who reads it or hears it or listens to it, just like you went, it allows their mind to kind of almost go across the whole scope of what we've achieved and what we've come to and the good aspect and the positive aspect, which has enabled all of these things to happen. So I think America matters. It really matters, and it would make a great slogan.
Interesting. And the left does like to say truth matters, facts matters, this matters, that matters. So you kind of play into their language. Yeah.
Black lives matters, all lives matters. Well, the point about this is that it captures it all, but it puts it under America, and America is the thing they're after.
Right. Let me ask you one more question about what we're seeing now. Dr. Marv Trager, again, our guest, former Marxist radical turned conservative, a retired psychotherapist and a Buddhist teacher. When we talk about what's happening in the country today in terms of these social dynamics and the economic dynamics and the cultural dynamics, I mean, a lot of things that are in flux and in play right now. What do you think conservatives need to know in order to be effective? And maybe this kind of ties in with your America Matters, but to be effective in messaging against this radical leftist ideology that seems to be spreading like wildfire right now?
Well, I think, I laid out, you might say, what is the basis of what the messaging ought to be. But, Jimmy, I think there's something more important than messaging, and that is being down with the people. I mean, I'm in my 80s now, so it's not the right time for me to be doing this. But if I were younger, I would move into an African-American neighborhood. That's all. That's what communists do when they want to build something. They get down and gritty. You know, we can't just live these over here quiet, comfortable lives. Now, I think that's going to be that's a tough one. It's a tough bridge to. But I remember in the Romney campaign, I went to Ohio. I volunteered for 3 months in the Josh Mandel Senate campaign and helped support the Romney campaign. And I was trying to get the Republicans at that time to hold rallies or do things in the African American community, and they just wouldn't do it. They just, you know, pretty much wrote it off. Now, Trump doesn't have that attitude. Trump, he himself makes connection, and his people make connection, and there's the black churches. But I think ultimately the African American community has to be the main place where this is action takes place on the ground and where they rise up, because otherwise the psychic culture of a people can't be changed unless the people themselves are doing it.
Yeah, engagement. That's the word. Engage the people.
Thank you. Engagement.
That's what you need to be doing. And I agree with you. In 2012, I remember other complaints in Colorado about the campaign not trying to exert any kind of effort in minority communities, the Romney campaign. And so that seems to be something that was pretty common across the country. Marv Trager, I want to shift gears to one more final question for you. I want to play a clip of our patron economist here on Jimmy at the Crossroads on Free to Choose Fridays, Milton Friedman, in Cut 3. Milton Friedman was in an exchange, I think in 1979, with Phil Donahue, where he was asked about and talking about fairness. And I think this is apropos because so many Americans today who seem to be drawn into the left are just wanting a fairer society. And I want to play this clip of Friedman in exchange with Phil Donahue and then get your reaction.
And freedom is not fairness. Fairness means somebody has to decide what's fair. And that means the FCC people have to decide what's fair. And I don't want the FCC people to decide for me what I should listen to or hear. And you wouldn't be able, if the public at large didn't agree with your choices, you'd be out of business.
Yeah, I would.
So you know, it's a funny thing. People think that it's the appearance of power versus the reality of power. It looks like as if you have a lot of power over what you put on your shelf, but you don't.
Really?
Because if you didn't appeal to the public, if these people didn't like you, do a marvelous job. I'm not questioning that. But you do a marvelous job because you have found an audience for your product.
So in other words, my power comes from the people, is your point.
Absolutely.
And
freedom is the ability to decide for yourself what is fair. And Friedman also said something, I'm paraphrasing here, that if you prioritize equality over freedom, you will get neither. What do you make of that?
Yeah. Well, you know, fairness is you know, if there's one word that you could say all Americans, right, left, radical, conservative, it doesn't matter. If there's one word that is in our DNA, it's the word fairness. Mm-hmm. We want things to be fair, and we don't want them to not be fair. And Milton is completely right. You can't impose fairness, because who's going to impose it? Fairness has to come out of your own choices and your own freedom. So I really think that he hit the nail on the head, and I'm happy to hop on his coattails 4 decades too late.
There you go. Me too. And I wasn't even alive in '79. You were still a leftist back during that time period.
Yeah, well, so I have less excuse.
Yes, exactly right. And I'll just add this in terms of fairness before we let you go. And that is, look, fairness needs to be before the law. Equal protection under the law, being treated fairly by the government. And one example of this leftist radicalism that we're seeing on display where fairness isn't being prioritized is in Washington State. You might have seen this. They're requiring everybody to wear a mask, but in Lincoln County, Washington, if you're a person of color and you feel concerned about wearing a mask, you don't have to. There's an exception there. That doesn't seem to be fair or to fit under the idea of equal protection under the law, particularly under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution.
Yeah. Sadly, there are more examples every day that it's almost impossible to keep up with it.
It is indeed. Dr. Marv Trager, what a fascinating conversation. We could just go on and on and on. It was nice not having more than one break, too. That's kind of neat once we got things going. Thanks so much for joining us today here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm sure we'll have you back.
Thank you, Jimmy. I really appreciate your inviting me.
Same here for you coming on. Thank you, my friend. Dr. Marv Trager again joining us. Ex-Marxist radical turned conservative after that roto-rooter process with his Buddhist faith and solitary retreat in 2001, particularly bringing about this evolution. We need to ensure in America that we remain free to think, free to act, and free to choose. And that's why we do Free to Choose Fridays, covering a range of important topics. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.